The air inside the courtroom was thick, thicker than the California heat outside, thicker than the tension hanging in the room like a storm about to break. Every seat in the gallery was filled, spectators whispering, shifting, waiting for the inevitable. To them, this was already over. Just another young black man caught in the system. Just another case Judge Walter Grayson would dismiss in time for his afternoon golf game. At the defense table stood Malik Carter, 19 years old, accused of grand theft auto and resisting arrest. Hands in his pockets, chin slightly raised, he looked at the judge. Not with fear, not with defiance, but with something else. Something unreadable. Across from him, Prosecutor Richard Vaughn adjusted his tie, smirking. This was routine. The evidence was stacked high, the testimony solid. Another easy win. Judge Grayson sighed, flipping open the case file with an air of boredom. "Let's make this quick," he muttered, barely looking at Malik. "I have a golf game at 2. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. Low, knowing chuckles from the bailiff, the stenographer, even the prosecutor. Everyone except Malik, because they didn't know what was coming. They didn't know that in the next few minutes, the entire case would unravel, brick by brick. That Malik wasn't just another teenager caught in the system. That he had spent years preparing for this moment. Not this exact one, but something like it. They didn't know that the system was about to go on trial. This story is going to shock you. Stay until the end, because what happens next will change the way you see justice forever. And if you believe the truth matters, hit that like button and drop a comment below. Let's get into it. Prosecutor Richard Vaughn rose from his seat with the confidence of a man who had already won. His suit was immaculate, his tie perfectly knotted, his voice carrying the smooth, practiced cadence of someone who had delivered the same argument 100 times before. "Your Honor, the state will prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the defendant, Malik Carter, was caught red-handed in a stolen vehicle, a 2022 Audi A6, reported missing just hours before his arrest." Vaughn turned slightly, letting his gaze sweep over the jury, his tone dripping with certainty. Officers pursued him through downtown, where he attempted to flee before being apprehended. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. The evidence speaks for itself. Murmurs spread through the courtroom. A stolen car. A chase. Fingerprints. It sounded damning. In the gallery, spectators exchanged glances, nodding. This was open and shut. Judge Grayson, still leaning back in his chair, peered at Malik over the rim of his glasses. "Go on," he said, barely suppressing a yawn. Vaughn smiled, a predator sensing easy prey. He stepped closer to the jury, his polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. "The defense may try to convince you that this was all a misunderstanding," he continued, "that Mr. Carter is just an unfortunate victim of circumstance." He turned, locking eyes with Malik for the first time. "But let's be honest, what kind of victim runs from the police?" The tension in the room thickened. The question hung in the air, its weight settling on the jurors. Judge Grayson smirked, resting his chin on his hand, waiting for Malik to squirm. But Malik didn't move. He didn't flinch. Vaughn, undeterred, moved to the prosecution's table and picked up a file. "Your Honor, I have here the testimony of Officer Daniel Ruiz, who personally witnessed the defendant behind the wheel before attempting to flee." He opened the folder with a dramatic flourish. The car was confirmed stolen. The arrest was made by the book. This is not speculation. This is fact. Judge Grayson exhaled through his nose, nodding. "Sounds straightforward to me." To most people in the room, it did. The evidence was clear. The case was solid. But Malik saw the cracks. He had spent too many years studying trials, analyzing how prosecutors built their cases, how they bent the system in their favor. He could see the gaps Vaughn thought no one would notice. Still, he didn't say a word. He just waited. Judge Grayson tapped his gavel lightly. "Let's hear the defense's response." Malik's public defender, Lisa Thornton, hesitated before rising. She was young, nervous. This wasn't her fight, and she knew it. She cleared her throat. "Your Honor, my client." Malik placed a hand on her arm, a silent request. She froze, uncertain, then slowly sat back down. And for the first time since entering the courtroom, Malik spoke. "I'll be representing myself." Silence. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "You'll what?" Malik's voice was calm, steady. "I'll be defending myself, Your Honor." A wave of whispers rippled through the courtroom. The bailiff's eyebrows shot up. Vaughn chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. "This should be interesting," the prosecutor muttered. But no one was laughing when Malik took his first step forward, because everything was about to change. Malik let the weight of the silence settle. He adjusted his stance, hands still in his pockets, his face unreadable. The courtroom wasn't used to this. Defendants didn't challenge the system. They didn't take control. They didn't walk into the lion's den without fear. "Your Honor," he began, his voice even, measured, dangerously calm. "Before I begin, I'd like to confirm something with the prosecution." Vaughn folded his arms, smirking. "Go ahead." Malik took a slow step forward, locking eyes with him. "You said Officer Daniel Ruiz personally saw me behind the wheel before I was arrested, correct?" Vaughn exhaled sharply, already bored. "That's right." Malik nodded as if considering the answer. "And that testimony is written in his official report?" "Of course it is." Vaughn gestured to the folder on his desk. "Black and white, plain as day." Malik turned to Judge Grayson, his expression unreadable. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony as evidence." The air shifted. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, a ripple of confusion spreading through the room. Judge Grayson squinted at him. "On what grounds?" Malik pulled his hands from his pockets for the first time and gestured toward the prosecution's table. "Because Officer Ruiz never saw me in that car. In fact, he wasn't even on duty when the chase began." A beat of stunned silence. Then, "What are you talking about?" Vaughn snapped, his smirk vanishing. Malik took another step forward, voice razor sharp. "If the court allows me, I'd like to submit a request to verify Officer Ruiz's GPS logs from that night. If his report says he witnessed me in the vehicle, then it should match his location history." He let the words hang, then added, "But I have a feeling it won't." A ripple of tension spread through the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward. Even the jury shifted in their seats. Judge Grayson frowned, glancing at Vaughn. "Counselor," Vaughn hesitated. And it was just long enough. The jury noticed. The gallery noticed. Most importantly, the judge noticed. Vaughn cleared his throat. "That report was filed by an officer of the law, Your Honor. Are we really going to take the word of a defendant over a trained professional?" Malik tilted his head slightly, watching him, waiting. Then, he gave a small, almost casual shrug. "If the officer was where he claimed to be, then the GPS data will prove it. But if he wasn't..." He let the sentence trail off, the unspoken truth heavier than anything said aloud. Judge Grayson studied him for a long moment, then turned to Vaughn. "Does the prosecution have any issue with verifying the officer's GPS logs?" Another beat of silence. Vaughn's jaw tightened. He glanced down at his notes as if searching for a way out, but he knew there wasn't one. Finally, with visible reluctance, he muttered, "No objections, Your Honor." But the shift had already begun. For the first time, the courtroom wasn't laughing anymore. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down on everyone like a weight they couldn't shake. Malik stood motionless, his expression unreadable, but inside, he could feel it. The shift. Vaughn straightened his tie, trying to regain his composure. "Your Honor," he said, voice clipped. "While we wait for the GPS records, the fact remains that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle." He turned to the jury, latching onto what he thought was still his strongest piece of evidence. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is indisputable proof. Malik gave a small nod, almost like he was agreeing. That's true. He took a step forward, letting the words settle. My fingerprints were in that car. A murmur rippled through the room. Was he admitting guilt? Even Vaughn seemed caught off guard for a second, before he smirked, mistaking it for surrender. But, Malik continued, his voice smooth, let's talk about that evidence for a second. Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow and gestured for him to continue. Malik turned to the jury, locking eyes with each of them, one by one. He wanted them to feel this, to understand the flaw in the story they were being fed. The prosecution wants you to believe that finding my fingerprints in a car means I stole it. That's the story they're selling. But let's think about this logically. He let the moment stretch, making sure they were all with him. Let's say you walk into a department store and try on a jacket. You put your hands in the pockets, maybe zip it up, then put it back on the rack and walk out. A few hours later, someone shoplifts that same jacket. Would the fact that your fingerprints are on it mean you stole it? A few jurors exchanged glances. Someone in the gallery muttered something under their breath. The seed of doubt was planted. Malik didn't give them time to recover. The car in question was parked outside a 7-Eleven hours before the alleged theft. I was inside that store with 3 friends. And yes, when we walked past the car, I leaned against it. I even opened the door because it was already unlocked. His voice remained steady, controlled, unshakable. I didn't think much of it. Didn't take the car. Didn't drive it. Didn't steal anything from inside. Just a dumb moment of curiosity. He let that sit for a second. Then, in a voice that cut through the silence like a blade, he asked, "Does touching something make you a criminal?" Silence. Vaughn's confidence cracked. He cleared his throat, flipping through his notes, searching for something, anything, to counter. But Malik wasn't done. And while we're on the topic, he continued, "Let's talk about how that fingerprint analysis was done." He turned to Judge Grayson. "Your Honor, was the forensic specialist from this case subpoenaed to testify?" The judge blinked, caught off guard by the question. He glanced at Vaughn. The prosecutor hesitated, then, reluctantly, muttered, "No." Malik's lips pressed together, his head tilting slightly. "So let me get this straight," he said, stepping closer, voice low but firm. "The state is using forensic evidence to try and convict me, but they didn't think it was necessary to bring in the actual specialist who processed that evidence." He let that hang in the air before delivering the final blow. No chance for me to cross-examine. No chance to ask about the chain of custody. No chance to challenge the accuracy of the analysis. Another murmur spread through the courtroom. This time, it wasn't just confusion. It was doubt. Vaughn's jaw tightened. His grip on his papers turned white-knuckled. Malik simply nodded, as if that was all he needed to hear. "Interesting." Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple. It was the look of a man realizing this case wasn't the easy win he thought it would be. The room was shifting. The walls were closing in, not on Malik, but on the very people who had built this case against him. And if you're watching this, right now, you see it too. You see how easy it is for a system to decide someone's fate without real proof. If this moment just changed the way you think about justice, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Malik's place? And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, subscribe, because we're just getting started. The courtroom was silent, but the tension was deafening. Malik stood firm, watching as Prosecutor Vaughn tried to gather himself, flipping through his notes like a drowning man reaching for a lifeline. But the case that had seemed so airtight minutes ago was falling apart, and Malik wasn't finished. He took a slow step forward. "Your Honor," he said, his voice steady, "I'd like to enter into evidence an official statement from the owner of the vehicle." Judge Grayson frowned. "The owner? Malik nodded. Yes, Mr. Raymond Whitaker, the registered owner of the stolen Audi. A ripple of whispers spread through the courtroom. No one had mentioned Whitaker's testimony. Not once. Vaughn stiffened. Objection, Your Honor. Grayson held up a hand. Overruled. Let's hear it. Malik reached into his file and pulled out a printed transcript. He held it up for the courtroom to see before reading aloud. I left my car running when I ran inside the gas station. Some kid must have jumped in and taken off. But it wasn't the guy you arrested. I saw the kid, and he was white. The room exploded. Gasps, shocked murmurs. Even the stenographer paused for half a second before scrambling to keep up. Malik didn't move. He let them process it. Let the weight of it sink in. Then, slowly, he turned to Vaughn. This statement was given to the police the night the car was reported stolen. He held the paper up higher. It's in the original police report. His eyes locked onto Vaughn's. The same report the prosecution conveniently never mentioned. Vaughn's face was flushed red. He stepped forward, scrambling. Your Honor, this is irrelevant. The defendant was caught in possession of the vehicle. No! Malik cut him off. His voice didn't rise, but it sliced through the courtroom like a blade. I wasn't. Silence. Malik turned back to the jury, his gaze unwavering. I was arrested blocks away from where the vehicle was abandoned, walking home. He let the words hang before adding, I wasn't in the car. I wasn't near the car. I wasn't running from anything. His voice turned colder, sharper. The only thing tying me to this case is bad police work and assumptions. Judge Grayson leaned back, exhaling slowly. The realization was settling over him, over the jury, over everyone in that room. The real suspect had gotten away that night, and the officers had decided that finding a black kid in the same area was close enough. The weight of Malik's words settled over the courtroom like a thick fog. No one was whispering anymore. No more chuckles from the bailiff. No more smirks from Judge Grayson. Because now, everyone knew the truth. The case wasn't about a stolen car. It wasn't about fingerprints. It was about assumptions. About how easy it was for the system to decide someone was guilty before the trial even began. Vaughn opened his mouth, desperate to regain control. But he had nothing left. No amount of polished arguments could erase the fact that the prosecution had ignored crucial evidence. That the police had arrested the wrong man. Judge Grayson exhaled, rubbing his temple. Then, finally, he turned to Vaughn. Does the prosecution have anything further? Vaughn's jaw clenched. His face was still red, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. But he knew it was over. No, Your Honor. A beat of silence. Then, the case is dismissed. For half a second, the room was frozen in shock. Then chaos erupted. Half the courtroom gasped in disbelief, the other half murmuring in quiet relief. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notebooks, cameras clicking. The bailiff's stern expression finally cracked, and even the stenographer looked shaken. But Malik? He didn't move. He stood still, letting the moment settle, letting the reality of it sink in. Judge Grayson, still gripping his gavel, looked at him with an expression that hadn't been there before. Recognition, maybe even regret. Malik met his gaze for a long moment. Then, without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. And just as he reached it, the judge's voice called out, Mr. Carter. Malik stopped but didn't turn. A pause. Then, Grayson hesitated, his voice quieter than before. You should consider law school. Malik let out a breath. Just the faintest curve of a smirk played at his lips. He didn't need to consider it. He was already on his way. Outside the courthouse, the air was thick with voices. Reporters swarmed the steps, microphones shoved forward like weapons, cameras flashing. Malik, did you know the judge would dismiss the case? What are you going to do next? How does it feel to outmaneuver a seasoned prosecutor? But Malik wasn't interested in the spectacle. This was never about proving how smart he was. It was about something bigger. At the bottom of the steps, his mother, Vanessa Carter, stood waiting. Her arms were crossed, her face unreadable. For a long moment, she just looked at him. Then, finally, she let out a breath, shaking her head. "Boy, you scared me half to death." Malik chuckled, scratching the back of his head. "Had to take a risk, Ma." She stared at him a second longer, then pulled him into a tight hug. Across the street, standing by his car, Judge Grayson watched. His posture was different now. The arrogance was gone. His expression wasn't amused anymore. It was something else. Reflection. He hadn't expected this case to be anything more than routine. Just another day, another defendant, another guilty plea. But now, he knew he would remember this one. Because Malik had done something most people never could. He made the system look at itself. And for once, it blinked first. But the question remains, how many other cases had gone this way? How many people had been convicted not because of evidence, but because of bias? Because of shortcuts? Because of a system that cared more about closing cases than finding the truth? Malik had the knowledge to fight back. But what about the ones who didn't? This wasn't just about one case. It was about all of them. And Malik knew exactly what he had to do next. This wouldn't be the last courtroom he stood in. But next time, he wouldn't be the defendant. He'd be the attorney. And when that day came, he wouldn't be the only one. If this story made you think, drop a comment below. How many people have been silenced by the system? How many never got the chance to fight back? Hit the like button if you believe justice should be about truth, not assumptions. And subscribe for more stories that matter. Because next time, it might not be Malik. It might be someone you know.